Hello, I'm Jared Morey, Director of Civic Dialogue at the Minnesota Council of Churches. At MCC, we convene, connect, and catalyze people of faith to build just, equitable, and livable communities for all Minnesotans. For 14 years, we've led MCC Respectful Conversations in communities experiencing or anticipating toxic conflict. With over 400 events involving over 9,000 people from across the upper Midwest, we know that we reduce polarization and increase peacemaking in college campuses, faith communities, cities, NGOs, and schools. Our program won the Minnesota Ethical Leadership Award last year, and program staff have been recognized by the Obama Foundation, the United Methodist Church, our facilitators recognized by the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and by institutions of higher education. This year, we're beginning to expand the toolkit that we offer in our region, as well as our partnerships, including with the National Group of Forward Thinkers at Democracy 2076. In this video, I'm going to talk with somebody who I met at a national event, the Bridging Movement Summit at George Washington's Mount Vernon in Virginia last September. Ade Salame. Her work is fascinating. She has exciting research about how you can start now to build peace around some of our society's longest term divisions. Ade, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jared, so much for the invitation to share about our research on political realignments with the MCC community. I am really excited to share more about our work at Democracy 2076 and celebrate our collaboration. Hello again, everyone. My name is Ade. I am a lifelong Minnesotan. I've been a Vikings fan my whole life. I grew up in South Minneapolis. I went to Minneapolis public schools. I even worked for two Minneapolis city council members, but I think most importantly, and probably most stereotypically, I'm obsessed with the state fair. And I'm also the program director for political coalitions here at Democracy 2076. And my work specifically is focused on political realignments.
Now, what made you choose to focus on realignments for Democracy 2076?
That is a great question. The reason we decided to really take on this project was because when we first learned about the concept of a political realignment in 2022, we started thinking back to 2016 when people were really shocked that Donald Trump had won the 2016 election. But after reading different analyses, it became really obvious that non-college educated white voters began leaving the Democratic Party after the 2008 election. And you started to see that shift show up in the election results in 2010. And that became super prominent nationwide by the 2016 election. But the analysis that showed that shift didn't come out until 2018, which is 10 years after we started seeing the shift, which is actually kind of wild to like imagine that gap. But it was covered in a book called Identity Crisis. And so we started asking, how can we know ahead of time what these slow growing shifts are? Because we don't want to wait 10 years to realize that a shift has happened after a presidential election.
Okay, so the alignments are those shifts then? I mean, what is a realignment?
Another great question. So, a political realignment is referring to the changes in who is in a party, like who votes for it, what that party stands for, meaning its underlying ideology, and lastly, what the wedge issues that divide the parties are. And that is something that happens roughly every 30 years in the United States. So, while our parties have remained Democrat and Republican in name over the last couple hundred years, like who is in those parties, what they stand for, and what separates them has continued to change.
Okay.
So I think in the last 5 years, but more urgently in the last 5 months here in Minnesota, it made me realize that like what we've been living through here is a realignment. Like the elected officials who stood up for our neighbors aren't part of just one political party. We have seen in this process that they're really redefining what their party stands for and its ideology. They are looking at the wedge issues that divide their parties, and they're maybe even also changing who votes for their parties. So, for example, during the Operation Metro Surge, there were bipartisan calls from our elected officials statewide, including Republicans such as Senator Abler, Senator Coleman, and Representative West, on the negative impact that the operation was having on our communities. And in that moment, the divide wasn't just about immigration, it was actually about the safety of our community members. And they redefined the wedge issue, the ideology that their party has here in Minnesota, and maybe again, who their voters are. Did you see this type of realignment as well anywhere, Jared?
Yeah, I do remember there was a gubernatorial candidate who even said that he didn't think that his party would be able to win because of how challenging the environment had become thanks to our experience of the ICE occupation.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. And I think it's also proof that the work that we're doing at Democracy 2076 isn't theoretical, right? Like, this is the exact type of experience that I think our research is designed to help communities prepare for.
So then how do you prepare for the realignment? How do you help shape what's coming?
So, we can help shape the forthcoming realignment by identifying emerging issues and working with communities to help them see themselves as pro-democracy rather than red or blue. So, we can ask ourselves, what can we be doing now so that we can act as agents shaping a realignment rather than passively observing it or analyzing it in hindsight?
Okay, but how do you do the research for that? Oops, I'm skipping
A
a slide
great
ahead here,
question.
sorry.
So, in our research, we identified 17 divisions, so areas of political belief that were scrambling the traditional left-right divide. And we identified that in four phases. So, in the first phase, we started by synthesizing over 100 existing pieces of research. So, we read articles, books on realignment. We really wanted to know what the thought leaders and researchers were already saying. And then we did a series of surveys and interviews. We were really trying to bring perspective in from people who were observing realignments in their own communities. And we did this by prioritizing leaders of large membership-based organizations. And those large membership-based organizations had a wide range of ideological beliefs, geographic location, racial backgrounds. And what we were asking them is, what has changed for your community over the last 30 years? What are you seeing right now? And also, what do you expect to see in the next 30 years?
So like bringing in a bunch of leaders who had like kind of the 30,000 foot view. I know a lot of those folks kind of spend a lot of time talking to each other in general anyway. Like was it like a lot of the same olds that you brought together?
No, actually. So there was a little bit of diversity there. We did bring in some unexpected voices for our interviews. Like we spoke with a fashion theorist and we spoke with someone who works on multi-party democracy systems. We really, again, wanted to get perspectives that were outside of like the usual political science lane. And the outcome of a lot of that research and outreach was when we first began to see the divisions emerge. So then in phase two, we really wanted to dig deeper into the changes that people were seeing in the present. And out of that process came a set of scenarios. And we did a lot of feedback from our participants on those scenarios to make sure that they felt plausible.
Yeah, and I know the report that we're going to have a link to at the end of this piece uh, has a lot of pages devoted to all those different scenarios. And I asked you to not spend too much time on them during our conversation, but for folks who download the report, it is really fascinating to see just these sort of three different tracks that Democracy 2076 imagines democracy could go on in the future. So I encourage you to read that if you download the full report.
Thank you. And then in our next phase, phase three, we wanted to understand how will we know if we're on track for those scenarios that I just shared. It was important for us to be thinking about what signs to look for and how we'll know if we're headed towards one of those scenarios so that we can make sense of the barrage of information that's happening and we can start thinking more clearly about how we can plan to interrupt, intervene, or advance those changes. And then lastly, we wrapped it all up into this beautiful report, and we put together these materials really with hopes that they could be useful and actionable. And I think this partnership is one of those action paths.
Yeah, I agree. And this is the part that really got me interested in what you were sharing at the Bridging Movement Summit was these topics that are polarizing for the future that don't neatly split into different party lines right now.
Yes. So the areas of emerging division, and I think often like when we talk about these types of divisions, like we look at them election by election, and that focus can shift based on our communities and how they voted. So to use 2024 as an example, we saw a lot of conversation around Latino voters and young men. And then in 2025, that's where a lot of that conversation continued to focus was on those two groups. And I think that approach of looking at those shifts can really work for like a 2 to 4 year time frame. But I also think that that is exactly how you miss those bigger shifts that happen over time. So, like what I talked about earlier with what we saw happen between 2010 and 2018, that was a slow growing shift that we saw again over time. And the thing to note about these 17 divides is they may not all be correct, and some of them might be combined, or some of them might underlie other areas. But I think what is interesting about these divisions is that, again, they are truly scrambling that divide between left and right as we currently see them, and they can help us understand political behavior and emerging factions. So, a piece of feedback that we got during our research process, a lot actually, was that people thought that these divisions felt like false binaries. Like a lot of people don't hold strictly one view or the other, but I think that that is part of the utility of these wedge issues. So, for example, one of the divisions here is tech optimism and tech sovereignty. And I think the thing that is interesting about that tension is the one side is the idea of tech being able to do what tech wants to do, and the other idea that it's in competition with is a more constrained, more regulated tech system. And I think the way that shows up currently for a lot of people is in AI. So there are a lot of people who are pro use of technology, but they also have concerns, and for that reason, they're pro regulation. And this is an illustration of how those wedge issues can be like false binaries. So again, meaning that people don't fall neatly on one side or the other, but somewhere in between. And ultimately, I think all of politics is a false binary. We've got really accustomed to the issues that they've been around because they've been around for so long. So when you think about issues like immigration and workers' rights, that binary feels a lot more fixed.
Right. So, and what you've really identified with the report is here are what is like 17 different issues that they're they may be false binaries, but they're certainly going to be, they have the potential to be used to still drive a wedge between us, and they have the potential to become used one end or the other by political parties for partisan purposes, but they're not there yet. Like this is, we're addressing them before they become sort of weaponized against us.
Exactly. And like to your point there, when we're addressing these types of issues in the state where they have not yet been polarized fully, I think that that opens up the opportunity for people to hear maybe things that they may not understand or may feel in opposition to. So it opens up an opportunity for that conversation. But ultimately, I think the goal is to help people make sense of exactly that, that complexity, right? And I think the thing that's actually animating voters and shaping our platforms can feel confusing. And these issues themselves are not necessarily new, but they're being reorganized in different ways. And again, that can help us start to look at the new categories and understanding what it is that we're actually seeing happen in our politics. Like, to give an example of something that is showing up here in Minnesota for all of us, another one of the divisions here is shared truth and fragmented truths, which is, it means that one side of the people are people who value having a shared set of information that we can all rely on and trust. And that's in opposition to people who are okay with the idea that we operate in like siloed, algorithmically controlled and shaped realities. And I would say before the events of earlier this year, like a lot of us were living in very different information worlds, like where you got your news, who you trusted, who you were in conversation with about things that mattered, like that varied depending on where you lived, what you watched, who was in your feed. And I think that like what's true for my neighbor, for example, could feel totally disconnected to what's true for me. And that's the fragmented end of the spectrum. And so for me, that's what politics felt like before the beginning of this year. But then Operation Metro Surge happened, right? And then we saw the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And then there was the occupation of Minneapolis and other cities across the state by federal agents. And I think all of that created something that felt really inescapable. And in that moment, something unusual happened. Like people who had been in different information silos suddenly had a shared reference point. And for me, what that looked like is I was joining my neighborhood chats. Like I was starting to learn my neighbors' names because we were sharing information with each other. And that's the shared end of the spectrum. And I think that my experience is that I was suddenly experiencing a shared truth with my neighbors that in some cases was really at odds with what I was seeing reported. Jared, did you have an experience similar to that?
Yeah, absolutely. That there was this space where I was in more community with people who I hadn't even had like two lines of conversation with before. We were together as we were making sure that the bus stop was a safe space for kids to be able to get on the bus and get off the bus without being harassed, trying to figure out just where we can do the most good for the most people. There was so much community building going on during that time because it felt like we were all just trying to look out for each other.
Yeah. And I think that that disruption has left us now in this moment of the after, right? Like, I think a lot of people are starting to question, like, where do we want to get our information? And again, like you, like, I'm now in conversation with people that I wasn't with before. And I think that that is a really unique opportunity. And I can learn now what it looks like to build a shared truth with someone that I didn't consider or even understand. And I think that the question that we have in this moment is, how can we maintain that sense of shared truth and not go back to our information silos?
Yeah, and there's a lot of interest in that, I think, especially in faith communities. One of the things that in mid-February I started getting all these calls, particularly from faith communities in the exurbs and in greater Minnesota, who knew that there had been this experience that was viscerally impacting to so many of their siblings in the metro, and that they'd had some sense of, but that they hadn't experienced with the same intensity, and that within these communities, there's a sense of widely divided perspective on it, but also just this great thirst for connection and relationship and better understanding of how the whole state has been experiencing this.
Exactly. I think, thank you for sharing that. And I think that this is a perfect example and hopefully helps illustrate like how these emerging divides can really provide a way to engage in respectful conversation, right? In this case, it really helps us to understand like what lessons we want to take forward from our recent experiences. But I think another way to use these divisions is to figure out ahead of time like how we can inoculate ourselves from division to begin with and how we can encourage open communication and understanding across difference.
Absolutely. And so to our viewers, as Ade said, these are polarizing topics that don't break neatly along partisan lines yet. But the anticipation is that they could become partisan and toxically polarizing if left unaddressed. Um, so in faith communities, campuses, and municipalities, we have the opportunity to engage in meaningful dialogue that can inoculate your community against this division if and when some of these topics start being used as wedge issues. We know that 87% of Americans are tired of political division generally, and the same percentage say that polarization is an actual threat to our country. And what's more, an easy majority, 70% of us, feel personally responsible for engaging in bridging, for connecting across our divides of worldview and identity. And especially for faith communities, here we're the Minnesota Council of Churches, we know that 47% of Americans want their clergy to help them talk to people on the other side. So we're well positioned to do something in this space. You know, when we at MCC hear Jesus say, "Blessed are the peacemakers and love your enemy," we say, yes, and here's how we can do it. How great would it be, though, for your community to never hate their enemy, to never hate their opponent on any of these 17 spectra, any of these topics in the first place? So, with the hope of being able to achieve that inoculation, we've combined the award-winning Respectful Conversations model with Democracy 2076's research to make available to Minnesota faith communities this year a respectful conversation about shared and shattered truth in Minnesota. Through these conversations, not just faith communities, but your community can reflect on what we have lived, experienced, and seen on the news since the beginning of the year. People will share their truths and they'll be able to hear the truths of others. These conversations, we know that they have an impact. I want to remind you the process that we have leaves with people saying that they are more aware of a variety of perspectives on the topic of their conversation. 69% report better understanding of others' points of view. People feel that the volunteers do a good job, our lead facilitators do a good job, and almost everybody, 95%, leave feeling heard. And you know how important it is to feel heard, especially when you're talking about something that matters so much like this. We've asked people before and after their conversations to provide us some survey data, and one of our most statistically significant results is how many people have increased their positive feelings towards those with whom they disagree on the topic of their conversation. Almost as significant as the percentage of those who understand other people's points of view.
I just want to highlight this is a really impressive data point, Jared, for MCC to have accomplished. I think that Something I've noticed is that a lot of folks in the bridging space don't have this level of metrics and evaluation to demonstrate that shift. But the shift really does show that there's an opportunity for growth and learning in these types of uncomfortable conversations. So this is really incredible to see.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, we love tracking our impact and we have the numbers and we also have like what people have told us. Folks talk about how they feel these conversations are critical to the future. They talk about how it doesn't change their minds. They still believe what they believed coming in, but that they learn others aren't malicious. Other people just have their own perspectives on whatever the topic is. One thing that we hear a lot about is how much hope the experience of a respectful conversation gives somebody once they've been through it. We've asked people, what was a surprising thing about you for the experience? Uh, I don't want to say I don't want to be insulted by it, but somebody said it works. I mean, it does work. I didn't want it to be a surprise, but I'm glad that they affirmed that. Uh, they're reminded how many kind people there are in the world. It opens themselves up to other perspectives. Uh, People share how much love they experience just as by virtue of being part of it. And we know that that we have these outcomes. We've been able to validate that reduced affective polarization. That's like how intense are your emotions against the people that you disagree with on this polarizing topic. So we reduce that. We help you to love your opponent on these topics. Increased bridging quotient. How capable are you of being a peacemaker in the future because of your conversation experience? People are stronger peacemakers because they go through this. And people experience stronger relationships. One of the foundational premises of Respectful Conversations when we started it back in 2012 was that the strength of our democracy is contingent upon the strength of our communities. The strength of our communities are contingent on the strength of our relationships, and the strength of our relationships are contingent on the quality of our conversations. And it's in that space where this model really has an impact. Now, we have a lot of conversations, a lot of communities that have been through these. I think I mentioned we've had almost 400 or maybe a little over 400 of these events with about 9,000 Minnesotans and Dakotans and Wisconsinites in the upper Midwest. But a reminder quickly on like how the process that we do works is it's a structured conversation with a topic. In this case, we're talking about shared and shattered truths in Minnesota. We have a set of agreements that everybody makes a sign of affirmation agreeing to. There's some video orientation, and then there are 3 rounds of deepening questions, each designed to help people to share a little, and then a little more, and then a little more deeply their own perspectives and values with regard to the topic, shared and shattered truths in Minnesota. After these circle process questions, we open up to a time for questions of genuine interest where people get to express their curiosity towards each other, ask more questions about what they heard, and just get to know each other better. Following the questions of genuine interest, we do have a debrief period, a reflection, an application where people considered their experience. It achieves the results I've already showed you. For faith communities, municipalities, schools, anybody that's considering doing one of these conversations, it's a sort of a 2-part process. There's an us part and a you part. The you part is that you provide room for the conversation, you provide a meal for the conversation event, and then we hold a table facilitator training before the event, and we ask that you provide significant refreshments for that training. We ask that you provide recruits for the table facilitator training, that if this is a public-facing conversation, that you provide some media support, helping us. We'll be sending out press releases anyway about it, but also supporting those press releases with an op-ed or a letter to the editor. We ask you to have some leadership, some folks who are ready to provide input on the framing topic. Right now we're talking about the framing topic being shared and shattered truths in Minnesota, and we want to make sure that we can frame it in a way that works for your specific community too. And then we ask you to provide a fee based on the number of anticipated participants so we can make sure our lead facilitators are well stipended and we can keep this program sustainable for the future. In return, we provide consultation on the framing topic, adapt the frame and the questions for your community. We provide a lead facilitator trained in our award-winning model. We provide training materials, print and video elements, a table facilitator training separately for your volunteers, online registration, extra amplification and invitation through press releases and our networks, evaluation information for your specific conversation, and a report based on that data within about a month of the conversation itself. And these conversations do have impact. People wonder, So I go to an event. What does it mean? We've asked people with longitudinal surveys up to, we send out surveys between 9 months and 2 years after the conversation that they've experienced. And in our last round of surveys, people said up to 2 years later that two-thirds of them were able to name a specific impact, either a change in attitude or behavior that resulted from their conversation experience. They've repeatedly talked about still being more courageous, more able to face challenging conversations, a greater appreciation for the perspectives of others whose ideas challenged their own worldview, um, comfort being more honest by also being more curious instead of feeling more threatened when they're talking to folks with whom they have significant disagreement. These have been great conversations, and we're so glad to be able to partner with ADE and with Democracy 2076 for this next round of just urgent and like research-based conversations to help prepare us for the future.
Thank you again, Jared. And we're happy to be a part of this as well. And I think that what is so impactful, especially about that last slide that you shared, two-thirds of participants, even up to 2 years past these conversations, still having that lasting impact, it's indicative of how impactful this type of proactive work can be on our outcomes. Like I think about my own personal experience in organizing, so much of what we do is reactive, so much of it is rapid response and in the moment. This type of engagement, this type of intentional preventative engagement, I do believe makes a long-term difference for us. And I think that the research that we share doesn't just tell us necessarily what is going to happen, but what it does definitively do is give us an idea for where openings for change could be. And I think that the work that we're doing at Democracy 2076 obviously is oriented towards that longer horizon. So 50 years to be exact, but we want to identify what are the decisions that we can make today that bring us to where we want to be in 2076. Like when you think about it, we're currently living in someone else's 50-year plan, so why not build one for ourselves? And I think, again, the goal is to not get people to agree. Something that you shared with me when you initially described respectful conversations that I thought really encapsulates the work that MCC has been leading perfectly is that the function of these conversations isn't that you end up agreeing with anybody more, but that you just hate them a whole lot less. And I think that faith communities have incredible resources for these types of conversations. So, like when you think about responsibility and covenant and what we owe each other, that shows up so richly there. But the thing that really excites me about the potential here is that I think that believers are uniquely qualified to be futurists. And I think faith communities have always understood the importance of long horizon work. Like you plant seeds that you won't harvest, and you do good deeds and hope that someone else will consider stepping out on faith. And I really think that's the orientation that this moment requires. And we are so excited to work alongside MCC to build out conversations on some of these other topics. So, again, if anyone would like to learn more about our research, the full report is available on the website on this slide. You can also feel free to send me an email at my email address that is on the slide here as well. And thank you, Jared.
You're welcome, Ade. And for all of you, all of our viewers, the communities out there that are curious about having a respectful conversation, here's my information. You see my phone number, my email. We'd be glad to talk with you about putting together a respectful conversation on this topic. We do look forward to partnering with Ade and Democracy 2076 on designing conversations around more of these topics because one of the challenges sometimes with a divisive topic can be that it's already split with a blue side and a red side. And one of the blessings that Democracy 2076 brings to the space is that so many of these topics, the split hasn't happened yet. So we're piloting shared and shattered truths in Minnesota, and we look forward to coming out with so many more that fit so many more of these spectra so that we can be equipping you to be long-term peacemakers and build a strong foundation for the future of our democracy. Thank you. And thank you, Ade, for being here.
Thank you.